is
Okay.
San Marino's an
Okay.
affluent residential county in Philly.
We are live.
Maybe Pasadena's an orange county.
Welcome everyone to our weekly basic income discussion group. Tonight's topic is racism. So this is obviously a very contentious topic, and I think we're going to have a lot of good discussion. Some of us read an article by Ta Nehisi Coates from a few years ago called "The Case for Reparations." It was a feature in the Atlantic that was pretty famous back in 2014. Yeah, and obviously this is a basic income meetup, so there are a lot of really interesting points about racism brought up in this article, and obviously the author wasn't really thinking about basic income when he was writing it. So what would have been different about the article if you were thinking about basic income as a possibility? And what can we say about the effect of basic income on the problem of racism in general and the problems that are caused by racism or related to racism? So we're going to be exploring all these kinds of questions. So I have a few quotes from the article to prompt our discussion, but I'd like to start by going around and asking people what they think about basic income's relationship to racism and to what extent it can help address problems, to what extent it can't. All that kind of stuff.
Yeah. Well, I'm excited to talk more today because I think there's a lot for me to learn about it. But a few things that come to mind are like some of the problems that they talked about in the article were sort of pernicious problems of poverty or of not having a safety net, even if you do have an income. And I think basic income obviously helps that for everybody, including groups that are disproportionately affected by it. So that's a relationship that I see. I also think that for some aspects of racism come from when you have a correlation between poverty and a certain race, which they also talk a little bit in the article. So for example, there can be real effects on your home value that if certain people move in or different things. So it wouldn't necessarily take the correlation away to have a basic income, but if it decreased poverty in general, it might decrease some of the sort of perceptions that then get attributed to certain races. So I'm interested in exploring that too.
Okay.
And also maybe what it doesn't address too.
Yeah, I feel similarly that if it's overall addressing poverty overall, there will be an effect. There's no going back though, and the idea of reparations is something that's real. I mean, to pull people out of where they've been stuck for decades due to racism, really. The racism that's going on today is real, but it's of course not like it used to be, and the racism from the past has now cascaded its effects into the future. I mean, into the present, and possibly the future. So it won't really help those problems, those past problems. But I agree. Going forward, it can only help. Yeah.
She basically said both things I was going to say. One, it can address the direct economic effects right now, poverty right now, but also that it can have an impact on the perpetuation of this going forward, where poverty creates a perception of poverty, creates a stereotype, and it can sort of break that cycle of perpetuating prejudice from one to the next generation in a small, perhaps growing way.
I think UBI would help it because some people, just only some people, they tend to be racist because they think that other people take their jobs. Mm-hmm. So for this kind of things, it will help. And I read something, a study showed that racism linked to low IQ.
A lot of the same things that folks have said about poverty. I underestimated how long it was going to take me to reread this article. So I got like 3/4 of the way through, but I had just gotten to the part about, sort of the end of the section on contract sellers in Chicago, where Coates says, talking about the sort of respectability politics and saying that adhering to middle class norms is what made these people such a lucrative target for speculators. The contract sellers did not target the very poor; they targeted Black people who worked hard enough to be able to pay a down payment. And so I was thinking about how, on the one hand, yeah, it feels really important to sort of like raise the floor of poverty, but that it's also like racism always finds a way. I think Michelle Alexander talks about that in the New Jim Crow, that like we just keep finding new ways, and so it feels like a thing that would definitely help, but that it's also like so many things we talk about not sufficient to solve the problem of racism. And just sort of thinking about the awareness of like maybe like unintended consequences of like, okay, if then there's this higher floor, are there going to be ways that people or systems are going to try to like do bad things with that, to be like, oh great, now like formerly poor people have money, how can we cheat them out of that, or whatever, just sort of thinking about unintended consequences.
Well, a basic income is implemented. Well, maybe for reparations that African Americans can receive like 50% more or something. Just like people with disabilities, like with in Manitoba, they have the basic income there. They receive like a quarter more or something like that. So that's along the same lines. They're both disadvantaged people, but so they could receive an increased amount to make up for that.
Okay.
I would like to add one more thing.
Yeah.
You'll be able to help traveling people more, and traveling other countries prevent racism, because people have lots of strong biases about other countries. I think
Interesting.
all countries have the same problem. When they see the real one, they change their mind.
The real what?
The real country.
When you have a preconception about what a country is going to be like, and maybe you're racist against that country's people, and then you go there, then that can help dispel some of the and I think that's a good point, and it also brings up the point that there's more to racism than just black-white racism in America, even though that's what this article is primarily focused on, and probably mostly what we'll be talking about tonight. I thought everybody brought up interesting points, and I have stuff I want to say about what everyone said. But first, I want to highlight this part right here, right in the subtitle or whatever that's called. Until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole. So I find reparations to be interesting because there's kind of two components to it. One is fixing the problem, giving people money, helping the people, and then another one is kind of this moral component, like making right what was wrong, or making up for bad things that were done, and that kind of thing. And a question I have is whether it makes sense for these two things to go together. Like, they both seem like worthy goals, but what's the advantage to keeping them together, and are there potentially advantages to having them be separate?
Yeah, so I guess an advantage to putting them together could be that if people are really on board with, for example, the kind of moral side, you can use that to motivate, for example, the financial side, or vice versa. I think the disadvantage is the same, though. Like, if people are really resistant, to be a little more concrete, like if people find the moral side more contentious and more subjective, and there's more debate about that, then you could hold back some of the other ways of fixing the problem materially if you were trying to keep them together. So I guess I think practically kind of depends on where the population stands.
That's interesting. Like a reward for moral behavior, almost, to be able to get financially rewarded.
Well, that too, yeah. I wasn't even thinking about that, but that's a good point. I was just thinking, like, let's imagine that people were on board with wanting to reduce the wealth gap or something like that, but they weren't on board with I don't know what some other thing that relates more to the moral thing.
They
Or-
weren't
or-
on board with admitting that it was their fault.
Right.
Right.
Let's say they weren't on board with framing it as reparations
Right.
for the past. Even
Right.
so like if you
Yeah.
framed it that way, you'd never get the actual measure passed.
No,
I would
I
just
agree.
think practically that could
Yeah.
be a reason not to put them together if
Right.
you were really concerned
The
about.
other moral
Yeah.
debt is pretty vague in a way for many people. They don't feel that they're morally responsible. I mean, Germany went through a lot because of the Holocaust and reckoning with their moral debt so that people wouldn't do that again.
Right.
Did you read the article?
I did.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. I did read it, but not. I read it when you recommended it a while ago,
Oh
and
yeah.
I've talked about it with people actually.
So because they talk about Germany and how Germany did pay reparations to Israel and the psychological, challenge of all of that, and
Yeah.
even how, the people in Israel didn't want to take reparations from Germany because they hated the Germans and they didn't want
right.
to take their money, and
Right.
there were riots and everything
Oh, wow.
protesting
No, I didn't
reparations
know
and
Yeah,
all
that's
that.
really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is
Um,
interesting.
But they ended up happening, and it ended up being, a good thing for the Israeli economy, and maybe also a good thing for, the German people to think about, what had happened more, and also just
Yeah.
for there to be some kind of reconciliation.
Well, it could also be that you could write it off. I mean, if you could write a check, so to speak.
Right.
I mean, people do that all the time instead of grappling with the moral issue of what
Yeah.
they're giving to. But that may be a way to do it, though.
Yeah, I mean, I
Yeah.
think that was part of the objection back then.
Yeah.
Yeah, Richard.
Actually, there's a whole branch of libertarian law where you don't have jail sentences. You just pay for whatever you did, like some sort of fine or whatever.
How does that work if you don't have any money?
Yeah.
Work it off.
I don't know.
Yeah, future
Yeah,
wages.
debt slavery or
Yeah,
something like that. Yeah. So something I found interesting about the moral framing is that pretty much any side of any argument you can kind of frame in a moral way, and you can get people who agree with you and feel like your side is morally right. So
No.
you don't think so?
I think some sides are not morally right.
Right,
No matter how
but are
they-
the people on those sides, do they think they're morally right? That's the question.
I don't know. I question whether Nazi Germany thought they were morally right.
They did.
Oh, yeah,
they did.
definitely.
Yeah, they did.
In fact, I have a ton of quotes. So I teach this in one of my
I mean, I
classes.
think they were right. They thought they were right.
Right.
No, I think they're right. But I think they thought they were right in what they were doing by
Yeah.
getting rid of these pests, these people that were lower than human.
Yeah.
But I don't think that it was a moral imperative on their part.
Mm,
Do you?
So a lot of the slaveholders argued that slavery was good for the slaves and a moral right in addition to being good for them. Even though the financial motive seems pretty transparent at this point.
Right.
So it just seems to me that people can kind of moralize
Rationalize
anything.
it,
Yeah,
yeah.
almost
And people
really
can
any
see-
position.
Yeah.
People can say that they think it's morally right, even if it's not like, oh, I'm doing this for a moral reason. They can say like, oh, I'm doing it for this other reason, but it's in line with my morals.
Right.
So-
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So
For Holocaust, everybody talk about Jews thing, but actually maybe they also did the same thing to disabled persons and
Yeah.
gypsies.
That's right.
yeah, and homosexuals.
Yeah.
Nobody
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
about-
Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
they think that they were defected people.
Yeah, Richard.
There's they actually there's a slave Bible where that's like a lot of the Bible's missing from it, and they remove like all the like Moses leading his people
Yeah.
free and whatnot.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, so
I
they-
read about that.
So they created this Bible for
Yes.
slaves to read, and they removed the parts that
About
would
freedom.
inspire them to
Yes.
not want to be slaves
Right.
anymore.
Mhm.
Wow,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
Very crazy.
Yeah, so the moral stuff. I mean, like, I think our country has a past to reckon with, and we've done over time, we've done more and more reckoning with some of the wrong things that our country has done and our society has done and our people have done. But we still have a long way to go, and I think that's a good goal. Kind of getting everyone into a place where morally they feel like this was an awful thing that we need to own and take credit for. I think that's a really worthy goal. But I also think, fixing the problems in our society, a lot of that can happen kind of orthogonally. And when we talk about basic income, that's money. It has no morality attached to it or anything like that. It's just money that goes to everyone. And I personally, I think a lot of the problems that result from racism or that are associated with racism, even if you don't fix people's hearts and minds and that kind of stuff, you can fix the system. You can make the system less racist. And I think there were some examples in this article where it talked about people moving into, or black people moving into white neighborhoods, and then the white people kind of not wanting the black people to move in, and they didn't have to be racist in their hearts in order to not want the black people to move in. They just wanted their home prices not
Property
to go
values,
down,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like we had a system that was punishing people for not being racist.
Right.
So we can build a system that doesn't punish people for not being racist. I think that helps. So giving kind of creating a framework in which people are at least allowed to kind of give up some of their racist tendencies, I think is an important step.
I guess I disagree a little bit because having lived through the 60s and the civil rights and all of that, it seemed to me at one point, I think it was Johnson who said, some people's minds can never be changed, so there has to be law. And once the laws were in place and segregation was outlawed in schools, then people were forced to be together. And I think that's probably true now. I mean, the example you give, but I don't think, I'm not sure basic income, because it's not all poverty based. It's not all about that. It's about a lot of other stuff. And sometimes you need to be forced to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And so changing the system, when you talk about that, I feel like I could see what was happening back then and how hard it was and how much strife there was about it.
Yeah, so I'm not suggesting that you implement a basic income and then racism goes away. I'm saying it can be a step, like removing some of these barriers. There are some people, who are going to be racist no matter what, but there's some people who maybe aren't. And giving them the opportunity to not be racist, I think, is really valuable. Go ahead, Richard.
Actually, schools now in many parts of the country, like New York, are more segregated now than they were back in the 60s. And America is the only country that provides funding for schools with property taxes.
Yeah, right.
So that's how
keeps it going.
Inequality.
Yeah, there doesn't have to be a law saying schools are segregated in order for schools to be segregated.
Right.
If you've got the system set up in such a way that white people have an incentive to move away and black people don't have a choice, then
white
that's what
flight.
you end up with.
That's what they call it.
And that's true not just for schools, but for
everything.
For housing and all of that.
I want to kind of flip what you said on its head. Instead of discussing how basic income can affect racism, discussing how racism might affect basic income.
Yeah.
There's a part in the article where it mentions that temporary aid to needy families in the 90s, the food stamp program, was designed largely to exclude black people, but politically was perceived as a giveaway to African Americans. And I think, I don't have proof, I don't have like a poll to show you, that there is very strong racial politics around welfare in this country.
Right.
And I don't know if that's because it's given only to the poor. Of course, there's a stereotype that African Americans are less wealthy than others. And I wonder if basic income can kind of make an end run around that by saying we're going to give it to everyone exactly equally.
Yeah.
And if that can escape the thorny racial politics that have plagued any welfare efforts for a long time.
Yeah. I actually have the same thought. Yeah. In terms of the pragmatics of like popular appeal for it.
Yeah, and certainly for reparations, if it's targeted specifically to black people, then you are kind of reinforcing some of the divide, some of the racial divide in the country.
And creating more resentment sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, they're getting more money now, so that would be.
But even if you're not creating resentment, you are kind of separating those two classes. There's the class of people who get it and the class of people who don't.
Right.
And there's so I don't know. Anyone else have any thoughts before I move on to a quote?
I have a fun thing I'd like to say to people.
Yeah.
Richard Nixon who was from Orange County,
Yeah.
saw basic income as a conservative alternative to
Yeah.
Johnson's proposals for Great
Yeah.
Society.
Yeah.
That's changed.
Yeah.
That has
The
changed.
Republicans, yeah. Well, Martin Luther King too wanted basic income, different reasons.
Milton
He did.
Friedman.
Yeah.
Milton Friedman.
Yep,
Thomas Paine.
very
Well,
different
yeah, I mean,
philosophies.
I think Martin Luther King in his last book, he wrote about, guaranteed income. I don't know if it was quite exactly a basic income, but it was very similar. And he talked about, a lot of the problems. I don't have the quote, but he said a lot of the problems he'd been talking about, during his whole time, he realized were related to issues that that could be addressed without addressing racism directly.
Right.
Yeah.
I need to say one more thing on this topic, which is like, in a sense, in this way, like basic income is kind of the opposite of a lot of these policies. So, well, these policies, like the one you
These
mentioned,
policies?
sorry, the one you mentioned where it, like, in some ways helped African Americans less than it helped other people, but it was perceived as favorable towards. So basic income, just by the nature of like the correlation between poverty and race, actually would probably disproportionately help Black people and other poor. I mean, because they're more of the poor people, and there's like each dollar is worth more the less you have, and so on. So it would have a disproportionate benefit, but in a way, but it wouldn't probably be perceived as readily that way because it's going to everybody. So
Right.
that's kind of a nice feature of it.
Seems fair.
See,
Yeah.
it seems fair, and it is. I mean, I think it is fair, but
Yeah.
but actually, in terms of like well-being, it would disproportionately help everybody who's poor, which is disproportionately Black people. So
Right.
that's
Yeah.
kind of a nice feature. But again, that's kind of the model where like you're separating the kind of conscious idea about reparations that this author is really interested in from these kind of like consequence-based things.
Yeah.
Just pointing that out, but I think it's interesting.
Yeah. And another question we might ask is, if we've, implemented a basic income and addressed a lot of the poverty issues in the country, and people no longer perceive, or white people no longer perceive, reparations as something that's going to be taking something from them or somehow setting them back, then does that give more incentive to reckon with the past and acknowledge it?
Can you say that one more time?
Saying if you've got nothing to lose anymore, like when people see reparations, they're like, "Oh my God, what are they going to take from me?" That kind of thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you've got nothing to lose, then maybe there's less of an incentive to ignore some of these historical problems.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
I think that's a major part of why people like this author, and I'm not discounting it, puts a lot of emphasis on kind of like wanting to view America well and stuff like that. But I think my personal intuition is that a lot of it has to do with the fear that tangible material things are going to be taken away or
Yeah.
diminished in
Yeah.
the future or something like that.
Right. It's less about
That's my guess, but
it's less about admitting that we did things wrong in our history, and more a fear of having something taken away from you.
Mhm.
Does that make sense? Yeah.
that's
So here's a quote. So a lot of this article talks about housing and redlining in Chicago and that kind of stuff. So this says, for should any non-racist white families decide that integration might not be so bad as a matter of principle or practicality, they still had to contend with the hard facts of American housing policy. When the mid-20th century white homeowners claimed that the presence of a Bill and Daisy Myers decreased his property value, he was not merely engaging in racist dogma. He was accurately observing the impact of federal policy on market prices.
right.
Redlining destroyed the possibility of investment wherever Black people lived.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
So this also goes along with the other quote you might have later about the guy who like thought the Black guy moving in might be nice, but like saw $2,000 go off his house every time
This is the same guy.
he looked at him. Yeah, and
Yeah.
so but then I had a question about the redlining.
Yeah.
So they only talked about it kind of briefly in terms of where the policy actually came from, and like what the point of it was. Like was it? I guess my question is, was it coming out of the pre-existing fact that that Black people were already poorer due to like the pre-existing history stuff, or was it like be above and beyond that? Does that question make sense?
I mean, are you asking whether it specifically targeted Black people or whether it targeted more poor neighborhoods?
Well, I know it targeted Black people.
It did.
Yeah, but I'm wondering if that was because nobody gave and nobody cared about being racist, and like black was correlated pretty highly with poverty, or was it like a more restrictive policy than you would expect based on that correlation?
What do you mean by more restrictive?
I guess I'm just curious, like, I haven't always in my head like two different kinds of racism. One is like statistical based discrimination, like you take the mean of a group and you apply it to individuals. And one is like norm based, meaning you're doing it how we might think of like purely racist. Like it doesn't matter, you could make a huge profit, but you're
I
gonna not do it anyway. So I'm just curious how much it was each of those.
There's, I guess it's from like one of the like real estate people and not from like the FHA, but like there's the quote about like, don't sell to like a middle class black man who wants to raise his kids in a good education and like integrate them in with white people. Right.
So that's a good example of the alternative.
Yeah. And I think it's really a combination of both. And when it's government policy, so when it's like the Federal Housing Authority, I would put more of the blame on actual racism than just this kind of like side effect poverty racism.
I don't also want to say that one is like not a problem or you know, I'm just pointing out there are two different kinds of things.
There are two different kinds, and I think, you know, we can hold the government accountable for creating this kind of policy because they're not in it for the profit. The government is not trying to profit off people's homes. They're trying to do the best they can for their people. And if they're excluding black people, then that's a problem.
What are the two norm based and statistical based?
The way I think about it, it's like, let's say that you have, so one example has to do with, let's say that you are trying to give a loan and all you care about is profit. You don't care about race in and of itself, but you also have no moral compunction about it. Like you're totally neutral, but all you care about is money. Maybe you're a computer algorithm or just a person who cares about money. And like, you know, if race is correlated with poverty for like, for example, all the reasons that are in this article, if a person comes in and let's say the only thing you know about them is their race, or this could be true for gender or other things, you might be less likely to give them a loan because statistically, until you find out their own personal financial information, you know that they're more likely to be poor. Now, really what you should do is find out their own personal financial information. So for example, you know, then if you find out they actually have a lot of money, like you'd be happy to give them a loan.
So
that's one kind.
The norm based.
The other kind is basically like, I call it norm based because there's models in game theory about how people often do this so that they avoid being punished by other people in their group or they get rewarded. So for example, in the Jim Crow South, if I owned a restaurant and I was a white person and I could make a lot of profit off of black people coming in, I would actually forego that profit. Why would I do that? Because if I didn't, other white people would boycott my store. It's not always that obvious, but that's a little bit, that's what I'm thinking of as the other kind. It's more like what Elizabeth said, the guy saying like, even if someone who is very well able to pay and all this stuff, like I'm still not going to want them in.
That sounds like the real racism to me.
Well, I mean, but sometimes it's not clear which one, and they feed off of each other. So like norm-based can create this correlation between poverty and race, that then people who are just self-interested are also falling. So like what Alex was saying in this quote, like people who only care about the value of their house, now they're all leaving too, just because they want the most valuable house. And so they kind of cycle with each other a little bit, and they reinforce. But they have different features. Like I said, like if you give individuated information, it will strongly affect one kind and not the other. So there's different things, different kinds of solutions sometimes, which is why I'm often interested in which is going on, because the solutions can look a little bit different.
I want to say, you mentioned a really, really key phrase, which is the government was trying to do the best for their people.
They're supposed to be.
I think where it was supposed to be. Where the policy comes from at that time and other policies in history is a kind of changing definition of their people. What it talks about in Virginia, their people was slave owners. So they had this great democracy where no one had to labor because all labor was done by slaves. So their people then was those who owned slaves in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And their people in the 1930s, where the government was trying to do the best for white Americans. And that policy was the best for white Americans. And it continues through history.
So I mean, like, it's almost, you can almost say like, you know, don't hate the player, hate the game, and the individual people participating in the market economy might be acting in racist ways, but they're acting within a racist system. So it can be hard to separate out, you know, like who to blame. But the government is writing the rules of the game. But then again, the government is working for the voters. So the voters are enforcing norms on the government. So it's not like the government could have just decided to do non-racist housing policy because then they wouldn't have been, you know, doing what their constituents would allow them to do, that kind of thing. So it's all these self-reinforcing cycles.
Although they did decide in some cases to implement laws that people didn't want just because,
and obviously
one of those cases, but
we've made some progress since then. But you know, there's still a long way to go. And I think, something like a basic income, since it's not specifically about race or, specifically targeting racism or something like that or discrimination, it's a way to affect that feedback loop without, obviously basic income is upsetting to a lot of people. A lot of people don't want to, give money to people who aren't working and that kind of thing. But if you could convince people of a basic income that it could break part of the cycle or influence part of that cycle and help alleviate it a little bit more.
Yeah, I guess pragmatically, I am in favor of things that address the problem without anybody feeling like something's forced on them that they don't want, because there is often a lot of creativity in terms of how to get around things that you don't want to have happen, and a lot of resentment, right, or that kind of thing. So
protests against it,
right.
busing in
And
Boston,
right,
was,
exactly,
I mean, a
horribly.
big problem.
Yeah, and you see that in some of these examples in the article too, of a lot of pushback. Yeah.
It still is a problem in Boston because there was a court ruling that if black people run away from the police, it doesn't mean that they're guilty. It's just that they're actively pursued by the police.
Oh, that's interesting.
It was last year, I think it was, or maybe 2017.
That's interesting.
Well, I'm not sure how that relates to the school scenario. What are you referring to? A new way of talking about?
I'm assuming that maybe before that it would be taken as evidence of guilt if you
Yeah,
ran
but
away.
who is saying that?
Oh, I don't know. Do you know what the court case is about?
Where is that coming from? That quote?
It's in Boston. And you were talking about how it's not a problem in Boston anymore.
What is it?
Racism.
Oh no, I didn't say that at all. I didn't say that at all. What I said was busing. The example of busing, people had to be forced into segregating the schools. They didn't want it. There were a lot of protests.
Into desegregating.
Yeah.
Desegregating. But of course there's still racism in Boston. I mean, that's a known thing. It's all, from my point of view, I've seen so many changes in it. It was so extreme before that I think people my age are likely to say, well, look where we came from. People are, don't have separate water fountains. They're not being hosed down in the street. All that stuff's not happening. So aren't we doing great? But I know that's not true. It's all really a matter of degree. But what I was saying was that forcing them into busing didn't work. So, I mean, there's still that resentment that we were talking about, and people protesting about it. I mean,
Just to be
ultimately,
clear, so people who aren't familiar with this, they wanted to desegregate schools by allowing kids from different neighborhoods to go to different schools. So they had buses that could, take the black kids to the previously white schools and that kind of thing.
And
so that was the idea.
And I even heard someone recently, the new police commissioner, saying that only showed that Boston was very neighborhood oriented. Even at this time, he's saying that they didn't want to bus. Well, but there's something to that too. They didn't want their children to go to a school way across town when they could walk to a neighborhood school.
Well, that makes some practical sense.
That makes some practical sense. But for him to say that at this point and defend Boston that way was pretty startling, actually.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I guess, go ahead.
I would say Boston is not racist at all.
Nobody's saying that.
Yeah, I love it.
Nobody's saying
Oh,
that.
no, she's saying it.
saying it.
Oh, using it?
I think that.
So,
I have never.
Where in Boston have you been?
That's a good point.
It has been 3 years for me.
Where do you live?
Right now in Quincy.
Okay.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah.
But I lived also in, for example, Austin,
Yeah.
Malden.
Okay.
I think it is
So-
a matter of degree
blatant
too.
and every
I think
day,
it's-
but there's separation.
There's
of races.
certainly a lot of segregation in Boston.
Communities,
There's definitely black neighborhoods
Yeah.
and white neighborhoods and stuff like that.
Mhm.
I think obviously it's not as bad as it used to be, but I look at how far we've come and I'm like, oh, look at how good we are coming far. Let's take that further and see how far we can go.
I think both are equally important. I mean,
Yeah.
I think if you discount, as Steven Pinker likes to talk about a lot, this other writer, if you discount progress, you can be blind to the fact that more progress can be made. Like if you discount all the progress that all the previous efforts actually did make, it can lead to cynicism. And sometimes people, I feel like, do that a little bit because nobody wants people to be complacent or to think that they shouldn't make more progress. But the downside of kind of discounting the fact that there has been some progress is again like to not actually learn what does
Yeah,
work.
to actually hopeful.
Yeah, and
Things
actually to
did
be
happen,
hopeful and
they did
actually to like change
Yeah.
some stuff. Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's important to me too, is like to be balanced about that, like you were saying.
Yeah.
So yeah, to not just like. Yeah.
Anyone have any more thoughts before I move on to another quote?
I guess just one more thought on like
Yeah.
the busing thing and the pragmatics of it is like when you think about solutions, like things that are less, again, like psychologically resisted could be better. For example, like instead of busing, maybe funding the other schools really
Oh, yeah,
well
absolutely.
might have been a better
And
start
a lot of people
and might have
felt
been more
That
successful.
would have worked much better.
And
But-
then over time,
yeah.
you might be surprised. Like it could turn out that a lot of the resistance to integration had more to do with the poverty, and after that, the integration could happen more naturally. I don't know if that's true, but like, yeah. So that's kind of how I try to think about solutions: is like what's going to be a more graceful
Well, people
approach.
didn't
that-
want to put their kids on a bus to go to a school that was lesser. That was the other thing.
Of course, of course not. I mean, that seems obvious to me. Like
Kind of
nobody's going to
obvious,
want to
yeah.
do that, and yeah. So if
And
you
they didn't
can
want
find another
them
way,
to go to
it
a
could be
school where
good.
they felt they might get hurt, that there was high crime.
Right, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those were valid reasons.
People were feeling forced to do these.
Yeah,
things,
they were
so,
forced.
So yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
that's
so I think
pretty obviously not going to be popular. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think like Richard was saying before, with schools being funded by, local property taxes,
That makes a big
and
difference.
obviously in the city of Boston, I think all the schools are kind of funded from a pool, or are they funded by the neighborhood? I think they're funded from a pool of the city of Boston. Is that correct?
Well, I
A
don't
pool
know.
of money.
I don't know.
Well,
Yeah.
that's neither here nor there. My point that I want to make is that if you make all the schools really, really good, then it can be easier to get people to send their kids to different schools.
Well,
Yeah.
that's been tried, and that's been said
Well,
and tried many times.
It depends what you mean by tried. Like, it's been said and
Well,
tried, but the schools
charter
aren't really, really
schools
good.
were kind of a response to that problem.
I'm not saying make a few really, really good schools here and
Right.
there. I'm saying make all the schools really, really
Right,
good.
and Head Start
Right.
was a response to that problem.
Right.
Getting everybody ready preschool in poor neighborhoods.
Right.
And I don't even know
And-
if that was a
Yeah,
rational thing, but that was one of the things they tried.
yeah.
But yeah, giving everybody the same amount of money, schools, would change everything.
Yeah.
The funding, yeah.
Okay.
Uh,
So here's one about Germany's reparations to Israel. From 1953 to 1963, the reparations money funded about a third of the total investment in Israel's electrical system, which tripled its capacity, and nearly half of the total investment in the railways.
wow,
So,
And 2/3 of the merchant marines.
wow.
right. Yep. So, and then you can see it keeps going. Israel's GNP tripled during the 12 years of the agreement. So, the money makes a difference.
Yeah.
The money makes a huge difference, and that's independent of what reason you're providing the money. It's going to stimulate the economy. So we might say that people deserve reparations because of all the harm that's been done historically. So therefore, it's the right thing to do. But if you can ever afford to give people money to make their lives better, is it ever not the right thing to do?
Oh, I think people would come up with reasons. I mean, let's blame the victim. I mean, a lot of people have that kind of psychology that
Blame the
people are-
victim?
Yeah, people are in dire straits because they didn't do A, B, or C, and they didn't make their own way, and they didn't
So they deserve
pull
to be
themselves.
poor.
Yeah, and so I mean, there's that to contend with too, along with the race.
I think
problem.
the issue there is that for every giving money to the needy, there's giving money to the needy, there's an equal and opposite taking money from someone else. People's issue is not so much with giving money away.
Right.
If we had all the money to give away, they'd say, yeah, go fix that, go fix that, go fix that. But like with reparations, it still is reparations. There's a fear of what is to be taken.
Right.
There's the knowledge that if we were to give this to someone, it's going to come from someone. And if I'm white and rich and live in the Atlanta suburbs, that someone who is being taken from is likely to be me.
I see. So then you
Or-
really have
yeah.
to justify the taking.
Yes.
Yeah,
And
or
then
if
we get to do
I'm
it.
poor and white, then I have my own story for why I
Yeah.
don't have money. Or if I'm, Asian American, or if I'm Mexican. I mean, not to take away from the case made in this article, but like it does end up into that discussion of like who deserves it and why,
And aside
yeah.
from the money, there's also a feeling of, well, I didn't do anything wrong. You know,
Right.
I'm not racist. That happened a long time ago. I'm not part of that.
right.
So there's a resentment about, why are you making me part of this?
So-
Generations have gone by now. Yeah.
I want to go into that because I actually am from the Atlanta suburbs,
Mm-hmm.
and my dad did the ancestry stuff. And yeah, my parents, my like seventh great grandfather Benjamin Roberts came here in 1793 from the West Indies or somewhere with 4 slaves. Moved to Tennessee, owned slaves right up until they could not anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Civil War came, they're like, crap, no more slaves.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of that generational wealth, that means I get to go on business trips to Boston,
Right.
came from the fact that my family was here early. My
Right.
family had a farm in Tennessee, and I accumulated that. And I think about that sometimes. What do I owe of my current life to what was done? Some unsavory things that were done in the past, and I don't really know. And part of the problem is that I'm like, I don't know how I think about that.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I guess what this opens up for me, which is tricky and doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing, but like there's kind of a whole can of worms of like really nothing in the world is all that fair. You know, and sort of where do you decide like you're going to do something about it because it's so egregious versus you're not? Like all of us are born into different families with different amounts of wealth, or born with different genetic attributes, or born, you know, have had our ancestors do good things or bad things, or you know what I mean?
It's
But maybe
egregious.
this is like strong enough that you kind of draw that
I think
line.
the slavery qualifies as something so egregious,
Yeah, that makes sense.
and as the Holocaust did, I don't think we had any question about that.
Right. But I guess I'm thinking for the arguments that other people are able to raise kind of against it,
Right.
you can kind of make, like Alex was saying at the
Yeah.
beginning, like I agree with you, but people can kind of make arguments
Mm-hmm.
because of the sort of ambiguous quality to it, I guess.
Right, and the lack of personal responsibility.
Yeah, like I think if you were the slave owner and
Yep,
you managed to live in your lifetime
Right.
through a change in consciousness so strong that slavery was suddenly seen as really bad,
Right.
which is kind of what happened with the Holocaust. It was
Yep.
like a pretty short period of time.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, it was.
yeah, I don't know.
You can argue the same sort of thing with climate change. We benefited from this in the past, but now it's getting bad, but we don't want to pay anything to try to fix it.
Right, so the people of the future are kind of getting screwed over by
Yeah.
I think there's 2 slightly different questions here. One of them is, who do we blame for the problems? And then another one is, how do we fix the problems?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, I can understand why framing things as reparations and adding that moral side of it would be useful if you needed to convince people to give something up and you needed like a solid argument for why they should do that. Now, obviously, there's an incentive to not think about it if if you're not one of the people who's going to be benefiting from it, and if you're one of the people who's going to perhaps have to pay a cost. But when we talk about basic income here, a lot of times we talk about how the economy has untapped capacity to provide things for people, and you give them the money and they can buy it, and it actually doesn't have to come from somewhere. So paying out a basic income and improving people's lives, if people actually believed that it wouldn't take anything away from them, then that can help mitigate some of that fear that people have. And that can be true if you frame it as reparations too, as long as it's not costing people anything.
But how would you think about that logic if you were like, giving more money to some groups than other groups or something like that? Because usually we talk about it as even.
Well, with basic income, we're not giving more money to some groups than other groups.
Right,
think
but
that
I
was
don't know if you were
suggested,
specifically talking about just that or any other measure that like would be funded or.
I mean, other measures don't necessarily have to take any money away from anyone, but it might be a harder pill to swallow if some people are getting it and other people aren't.
Could you lay out just in broad terms for me what you mean by it doesn't have to come from anywhere?
Right. So, in order for the government to spend money into the economy without causing inflation or something like that, there has to be something for that money to buy.
Okay.
So, if your economy has a certain the economy isn't going to produce what people don't have the money to buy. So, if we're stuck in a situation where people don't have enough money to buy things, then the economy ends up producing less than its maximum potential. We run an output gap, and that's what I would say is the situation that we're in now. So basic income can help fund consumer spending and allow the economy to reach its full potential. So you might say, well, maybe we're not running an output gap, so this whole thing doesn't work. The economy is producing everything it could. If that's the case, then in order for the government to be able to spend money, it has to figure out a way to free up resources that can go toward producing the things that that money would buy. And just, like taking money away from Jeff Bezos or Bill Gates isn't going to do that, because that money wasn't going to be spent in the productive economy anyway. You're still adding new money to the productive economy. So in order to pay a basic income, it's not a matter of where does the money come from. It's a matter of whether that money has somewhere to go. I think that's the way to think about it.
I think most people wonder what it's backed up by in order for it not to cause inflation.
Right. It's backed up by the productive capacity of the economy. If
That's what
consumers
you're
are
saying.
spending
It's kind
more
of a
than the economy is
switch.
able to produce for them,
Right.
then you get inflation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was interesting that the article mentioned that a Southerner was in favor of reparations right after the war because he thought it would be like a stimulus for the South, which is a little bit along the lines of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I think I have that one somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah, this one. In the 20th century, the cause of reparations was taken up by a diverse cast that included the Confederate veteran Walter R. Vaughan, who believed that reparations would be a stimulus for the South.
Right.
Yeah, of course. Money is going to be a stimulus. If people have money to spend, that's going to, now businesses have more customers, they can expand, all of that. You're activating latent productive capacity.
Right.
So yeah, I think that's a great reason to give people money. Do we need to frame it as reparations? Does that help or hurt the cause of giving people money if we frame it as
I
reparations?
think it hurts.
You think it hurts?
Yeah, I do.
The only
I
thing,
think making people feel guilty about things generally will hurt the cause.
yeah.
So if we need to make people feel guilty and we need to give people money, we should do those as separate operations.
Yep.
I mean, I find it from all practical perspectives that I can think of, it seems like it would be worse.
Yeah.
I'm interested. I wish we had I wish we had African Americans and other people in the room because it seems like there's a motivation that at least the author is talking about, to have things acknowledged and to kind of like a sort of aspect of reparations that isn't about the material.
Well, that's
benefit.
the moral debt that we owe.
Right,
I
exactly.
think it should be separate from the
Yeah.
monetary part. Though.
Right. Yeah. So I wonder how we would achieve that, but I do think it would
Yeah.
slow down the monetary part at this point, given where the people are in the country and
Yeah.
yeah.
Go ahead, Richard.
In Germany, they actually have a core. Have the Holocaust as a core place in their curriculum in high school
Right.
and things,
Right.
and so, and even people, the Middle Easterners had absolutely nothing to do with the Holocaust are taught all the things. They're like never again and whatnot.
Yeah.
Right.
And that actually makes sense in terms of talking about
Right.
the reparations in the other way.
In the other way.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
maybe
making
education is a good
education.
form. Yeah.
And raising awareness and not letting. I mean, Holocaust denial is a real thing, and I imagine that eventually we'll get to slavery denial. I
They actually are there right now.
we're there. All right. Yeah.
Wait, really?
Mhm.
That's pretty bad. Oh,
Yeah. So education.
right. Yeah.
Is re-education really is
Yeah,
the important thing.
And I guess education of this kind of stuff, like the causal pathway or the intermediary things that since slavery that the article talks about. Because personally, we learned a decent amount about slavery, but we didn't really learn about much of this. And we learned about Jim Crow and stuff, but we didn't really learn about much of the 20th century kinds of things that
And
that
the
were
effect
going
of
on.
redlining, which is huge.
Yeah,
I never knew
exactly.
about it until that article.
Exactly. So I think that would help people's understanding, in particular, the kind
How
of
it
victim
comes to the
blaming.
present.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
how
not
it
just
comes.
something in the past.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right.
Actually, it talks about it sort of in the article. Like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and whatever, they actually were trying to with the subprime mortgages, we're trying to target and improve the lives of African Americans and minorities, but it was exploited and and that caused the 2008 financial collapse.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they talk about I think Wells Fargo and Bank of America, and they interview some of the people who are actually working as loan agents there, and they were definitely thinking about it in racist terms. Like, it was an explicit thing. It wasn't just like, oh, there are these people who need this thing and we have a product that can help them. It was like, these idiots in these places, find more, like people to target, et cetera, et cetera. They were very kind of callous and non-caring about it.
Right.
Yeah.
What are the qualities that made Black people targets in this particular case? Like, was it just malice, or was it also that like they don't have, in addition to maybe as many financial resources, like cultural capital resources to be able to?
Oh, and it's also that they are financially illiterate.
That's what I was wondering.
Quite often illiterate, actually.
Right. So it was that they were poor, they were financially illiterate, they were in bad financial shape, so they couldn't get regular home loans. So I mean, like, I think the motives for targeting them are kind of pretty market-based, like, oh, well, this is where we can make our profit.
Right.
But then in terms of as they were doing that, how they were thinking about it was not very compassionate.
Right. No, I'm just trying to think like solution-oriented, like what would you need to put in place so that Black people are not attractive targets for these kinds of things, basically.
Well, the first step is to make them not poor.
Well, that's what I'm thinking about.
And I think, the very fact that we think of homes as investments, that we think of houses as investments.
The whole thing is sort of all over this article too. Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's problematic because a house is, that's the most important thing about it is that it's where you live. But then kind of people are tying that to their wealth and their accumulation of wealth. Like if these white people in these white neighborhoods didn't care what the price of their house was, maybe they wouldn't care as much if a Black person moved into their neighborhood. But they're thinking of their homes as investments. And I think that can be part of the problem too.
Maybe you can have like pro bono lawyers looking into contract mortgages and things so that they wouldn't be ripped off. Right. That could improve the situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it could. Part of the problem is, like they don't. It's similar to kind of like the payday lending thing. A lot of times they don't have they don't have another option other than these kind of loans with really bad terms on them. It's not like, oh, we'll get this lawyer and he'll filter out all the bad stuff. Once he's done that, there's nothing left a lot of times for people who have who don't have the finances to be able to get it. Yeah.
Does nothing left include renting, or like is it a better investment to buy a home? Because sometimes I get confused about this. Because I'm not like buying a home right now. Like, it's not obvious to me that that's always the best financial investment. So I was wondering where like the drive to buy a home came from. If it was like part of a cultural ethos, or if it was also really genuinely like the best way to build wealth. Because they talk so much in the article about that, right?
Yeah.
I think it comes from the same thing as the contract thing in the 60s. It is that, these people have been othered in American life, and they want the emblems of Americanness that have been denied them.
Right.
And a home is one of those big things.
Yeah.
It would be easier targets because they want it more. They need to prove they have more drive to prove they're American than others.
Yeah, and they did have quotes saying things like that. Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good
the American dream.
Yeah, so
post World War II, that drive to be homeowners.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And car owners.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's tricky because these things require these big loans, so then you're like open to predatory stuff, and you also like have this risk of like if you miss a payment or this kind of stuff. Right.
I know.
Yeah, so it's like it's a very dicey kind of investment. It's not like when you already have the money and then you put it in the stocks, and if you lose it, you lose it. But it's like it's even dicier than that because you've got these loans involved. And yeah, I don't know. It seems dicey to me.
Yeah. He talks about a woman who used to live in the South, and then like all the white people had these homes and they were rich and they lived these lives, and then she moved up to Chicago and wanted that for herself. And I think that's a reasonable thing to want. Kind of the way they set it up with these contracts is that you're basically renting until like you've paid it all off, but they never let you pay it all off. They find ways to have you break the agreement or something like that. So they did end up suing these contract sellers, and some people got to keep their homes. But I mean, this kind of thing isn't happening exactly that way anymore.
During the 2008 meltdown?
No, this is earlier on. This is like the 70s, I think, late 60s maybe. Yeah. But is it important that people own their own homes? I think ultimately what's important is that people have a place to live. I don't know. I think for some people it's better to rent, and for some people it's better to own. It's different. It comes with different costs and different benefits.
Right.
I think the basic income idea changes how I think about investment too, because like right now you're kind of expected to invest in order to fund your retirement, in order to fund like various things. You're supposed to like accumulate money for the future. Whereas if you could count on a basic income kind of indefinitely, investments would be more of like an added bonus. I think you wouldn't actually like, because you would have the same basic income going on when you were older too, if it was sufficiently high,
Right.
So that might change the sort of whole idea about investing.
And I think everyone would benefit if people weren't thinking of homes as investments. Everyone would benefit from housing being cheaper, because then it's cheaper to live somewhere, right? That's kind of good for anyone who wants to live somewhere. And anyone who wants to buy a house, anyone who wants to pay rent, like lower prices better. The people who benefit from higher prices are the ones who already own the property and they want it to go up, and they want to be able to increase rents or sell it at a high price or something like that. But if you take away some of that incentive, if that's no longer a thing, like people have to like invest in this real estate stuff, then I think that would be a really good thing for everyone.
I mean, the homeowners are always going to want the house values to go up, but the question is, I guess, like where are the government policies seated on this whole continuum?
Are the homeowners always going to want their house values to go up?
Yeah.
So
you
wait a
always
minute.
want more money
Wait a
versus
minute.
less money.
I can imagine an economy where all home prices are pretty low and they stay kind of low, and if you want to move, you pay roughly the same amount that you sold your house for in order to move into the new house and that kind of thing, and it can be fairly stable. Like I don't.
Well, of course, I'm not saying like that wouldn't be okay, but I'm saying like all else being equal, if you already own the property and you would rather it go up than go down.
Right, you want your own. I guess you want your own property to go up as long as it doesn't affect everything else. But you wouldn't necessarily want everyone's prices to go up.
No,
everywhere.
just yours. But in aggregate, the owners want their prices to go up.
There is a split mentality there between if you have the freedom to change homes. If you are rich enough to afford people to move when you want to go up. So it goes up, you sell it, you buy a nicer one, and you climb that chain. But there is probably a majority of Americans who are below that wealth threshold, who to them the value going up means more property taxes. Means it cuts into their actual day-to-day income. And they're not thinking this as an investment. They think of, I just need a place to live, so they may want to stay. They don't want it to go down if that still feels bad. They want it to stay relatively stable.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's a good point. That's a really good point with taxes. And
there's also home equity, right? If the price of your home goes up or the value of your home goes up, you have more equity and you can take out loans and stuff like that. So that's a benefit to it as well.
But your point also, like, I guess the policies could play around with taxes to change the incentive for prices to go up. But
and I mean, like something like a basic income, we can imagine. I've mentioned this before, but it's going to improve the quality of life in cheaper areas more than in more expensive areas, because you get more bang for your basic income buck. So you would imagine that of the people who are indifferent between living in an expensive place or a cheaper place, they'd be moving more to the cheaper places. So you'd have kind of a net migration away from like the really, really expensive places to live, and that can kind of help crash the housing markets or make it more reasonable. Bring prices down.
Up there.
Ryan Moss. At least $4 trillion were circulated in the bailout of banks and other industry, yet Americans have a problem if one dime is given to reparations. I think that's a really good point. The economy has room for consumers to have more money. We're able to do that. Now, a lot of the $4 trillion that were circulated for the bailout, if you put that amount of money in consumers' hands all at once, it's hard to say what the effect would be, because a lot of that didn't reach consumers, so it didn't really have an effect on the productive economy that much, other than kind of stabilizing the financial markets, and that kind of infrastructure is important for the productive economy as well. But the fact that you spent $4 trillion in one part of the economy does not mean that it would have been possible. Does not necessarily mean that it would have been possible to spend that $4 trillion in another part of the economy. But I think we do have room for giving a lot more money to consumers.
It's also interesting, like politically, like the bailout was pretty unpopular, but probably not as unpopular as reparations. So I have to like ponder why. I mean, that's just a guess that it isn't. That's just a sense. I don't know if everybody agrees.
That is true. Congress actually voted it down the first time and said, no, of course we won't bail out big banks.
Right.
And the Federal Reserve kind of very quietly came to Congress and said, we really need to do this.
Yeah.
And they passed it.
Yeah. I guess one reason for that could be that people do perceive the stability of the financial sector as kind of affecting the prosperity of everybody, and they don't necessarily perceive the like stability of the whole subpopulation of the country as affecting the prosperity of everybody, which is not necessarily accurate. But that's my sense, is that people make more of a connection with the financial sector and everything
But
else.
the same
Yeah.
kind of psychology of resentment was operating then
True, yeah.
about the big banks. Let them fail.
Yeah, exactly.
They got themselves in trouble.
Definitely,
Why do
yeah.
we have to bail them out?
Right,
You know,
right.
it's that same sense of
Yeah,
it's your
it's true.
life. You figure it out.
Right.
So I think Max is right that a lot of this came from pressure from the Fed.
Yeah.
So the Fed, obviously understands things that most ordinary people don't understand about how the system kind of fits together and all of that. So I think they understood that if you didn't do this, we would have some pretty serious problems.
You could have made it a loan to the banks.
In terms of how you structure it, I mean, they actually had various facilities that were structured in different ways. But yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can structure this kind of thing.
What now you're talking
Talking about the bailouts in 2008.
I think some of them did pay back. I think some automakers made it a point to pay back their bailout
Or we
money.
could have made it like paid it like equity into it, like GM, but we sold the GM stock back at less than it could have been.
I think they did that as well.
There was AIG that the federal government bought a lot of. I
Yeah,
don't know what they do, but they bought AIG.
yeah, they tried all kinds of things, and they did all kinds of things. Yeah, it's interesting because most people, I think, would think about, if the government can spend $4 trillion, then why couldn't they have spent it in this other place instead? Even if that doesn't actually add up economically, most people do think about it that way. So then the question is, would they have been more okay with something like reparations? Or would they have been okay with something like reparations if it wasn't called reparations? More okay than with a
Like if the
bailout.
freedom deal dividend with Yang.
Right.
Yeah.
Or I mean, during like the bailouts, I mean, Elizabeth Warren talked a lot about like bailing out like Main Street instead of Wall Street.
Right.
And so this idea
Right.
that like, okay, like, if the banks, have like done all this predatory lending and like ruined people's lives, like we shouldn't be like rewarding the banks for that. Like I don't think she would have necessarily said like, we should
Right.
pay back
Right.
the specific people whose mortgages were ruined, but like I don't think she would have been opposed to that.
Yeah.
And like, and if it was done, so I mean that's not reparations exactly, but if it had been like, okay, so like we've destabilized like the housing market, like we should then like give more money to people so they can actually afford to buy houses. Like that would have been probably politically more probably. It's not really reparations per se, but if it was like here's targeted money. Like you could do it in a broad like UBI kind of way where it's like, okay, we're gonna give everyone like housing vouchers in some way. It's like here's a chunk of money that you could use towards housing because we recognize that like that we let the banks really mess up the
Kind
housing.
of like disaster
industry.
relief, targeting a disaster, by giving money to that purpose.
Yeah.
But I mean, putting money into one place or another is politically driven. I mean, it's not like you can move from military aid to school aid, for example, which people always talked about doing. Why not put that money into schools? Why put it into the military? Well, those decisions get made politically.
Right. I like that you said, Elizabeth, that that we let it happen, that we let the banks do these things, and I think that's exactly right. And we didn't just let it happen; we kind of incentivized it to happen through monetary policy. So like lowering interest rates. You want more people to be able to buy homes. Oh, let's lower the interest rates. Make it easier for people to buy homes. All kinds of monetary policy, economic policy, basically incentivizes these bubbles to kind of get more spending into the economy. Allow people to buy more things. And really, the alternative to that, of course, is just handing people money. That is, another way you could go about it, and it's a way that's far more stable and is not going to result in this kind of crash. So I thought that was it's important that you said that. Yeah.
Should we have another quote about racism?
Let's have another quote. Should we do this one? Yes. So I like this one. For a couple reasons. Today, Charles Ogletree, the Harvard Law School professor, argues for something broader, a program of job training and public works that takes racial justice as its mission, but includes the poor of all races. So there's two things here that are important. One is that it's going to everyone, but still with the idea of addressing racial justice. And then the other thing that is that he's doing it through job training. That he wants to get people into the labor market, and of course he wants people to have incomes, but he wants them to earn it through jobs, and he wants to make it happen that way. And I think that's a problem. For reasons we've talked about before. I don't know.
I thought you'd noticed that quote.
Yeah, I was like, oh, job training. Click. Yeah.
Well, and to take it even further, like we sometimes do, if those jobs are not really needed, it's like, I'm not going to say it's like another kind of slavery, but you're kind of like forcing people to work unnecessarily in order to get the money, which, given that you're supposed to be dealing with racial justice, doesn't seem like the optimal thing.
Right. It's like, ooh, are we recreating slavery here by forcing them to get
again,
jobs?
we're not.
Right.
It's not anywhere near as bad, but like, yeah, I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, Richard.
In a Freakonomics interview with Andrew Yang a couple of weeks ago, he pointed out to a statistic that only like 20% of the people who would need job training actually get it, and it's really ineffective. So of those that 20%, only like 2% actually complete the job training, so it's really ineffective and it wastes a lot of money.
Yeah. So I think fundamentally people need money, not jobs, right? And if we need people to work, then we can pay them. We don't need if the private market economy needs people to work, the labor market can pay people to work. And they can figure out how
to pay for their training too.
They can pay for the training. They can, if you really need the labor, you can pay for all those resources.
Right.
But the government, the government's responsibility is the well-being of the people, and the people, what they need is money. I like his idea of addressing, racial injustice through a broader program, because I think it's inclusive and it doesn't create more kind of separations in our culture and our society. But I would have preferred if he was talking about something more like a basic income than a job training program.
Yeah, I think what creates his approach is that in our culture, as a result of the lack of basic income for always, there is a sort of fetishization of work unto itself, of work as an end unto itself, and not necessarily the benefit that work gives.
Right.
The idea that the point is that you are doing some kind of work. Say you're a receptionist, and you sit there in the office, and your job is just to make the company look really important because they have a receptionist. And your opinion on that may vary. But that's actually a bad example. So receptionists, they provide a reasonable function, right? They make the company look important. They are paid to do that.
Yeah.
But I think from my experience in the corporate world, I'm not going to name names, there are a lot of corporate jobs that exist basically because they were once created, and it is far easier to create a job than to end it. And they just keep existing. People keep filling them because you have to work to live, and you just sort of sit there at your desk and you say, okay.
Yep.
Right.
BS Jobs by David Graeber.
What?
BS Jobs by David Graeber. He covers a lot of that.
Yeah. And there are also jobs that are important to the employer and feel meaningful to the employee, but they're still not necessarily jobs that would exist if we had an efficient market. So, for example, if we're using monetary policy to lower interest rates, then some businesses that wouldn't otherwise exist are now existing because it's easy for them to borrow, it's easy for them to roll over their debt, et cetera, and they're hiring a bunch of people. So from the perspective of those businesses, they need all those workers, and from the perspective of the workers, they're all doing something important, and they feel like they're doing something important, but then maybe the entire company didn't need to exist in the first place. Like Japan, you hear about like zombie companies in Japan and stuff like that, and these are all jobs and businesses and maybe even entire industries that wouldn't exist in an efficient economy. So people are working even though we didn't really need them to work in the big picture. Yeah.
And it's interesting because I think this sort of focus on work, like you were talking about, is very much in this article. But at the same time, they talk about some of the costs to having to spend a lot of time at work, like the person who had to work 3 jobs and then like couldn't spend that time with his kids and stuff like that. So it kind of both
Right.
come up. But there is like a real cost to having people spend their time in this way instead of some other way.
And something that's different today than maybe in the case of slavery is that in slavery, the owners were actually benefiting from all of this work. So it was actually like you could make the case more that it was kind of a form of exploitation. But today we have all these people who are working 2-3 jobs, that kind of thing, and they're suffering, and we don't necessarily need that labor. We're just forcing them to work as, like, big picture, we're forcing them to work as an excuse to get incomes to them. And it's just like, it's almost worse in some ways.
Well, it goes to a really, really fundamental decision we have to make as a country, which is that do we live in sort of a scarcity economy where you have to work to eat?
Right.
Or do we live in a kind of abundance economy? We're going to say, we're going to give you enough to live, do what you want. And that's a choice that cannot be made in this room or by me, but has to be made at some point.
Yeah, and I think it's a continuum too, right? It's like, how much scarcity is there? And then how much scarcity do we, like, ultimately how much scarcity is there in terms of the resources that are available to us? And then how much scarcity do we want to subject our people to? And is there any reason why people should be experiencing more scarcity than what's possible? I would say probably not. I would say it's good to give people as much as we can give them, and that's probably a good thing for everyone. But yeah, I mean, there's always going to be resource limits, but imposing limitations beyond what's necessary is harmful. Yeah.
One, kind of to your earlier point, one of the possibly powerful rhetorical points that this article doesn't go into as much is like perhaps the ways in which things have shifted so that it's not necessarily so zero-sum to lift up Black people in poverty. Like, it can be good for other people as well, good for the economy, good for crime, good for a whole bunch of things, possibly, right? And so, like, like you said, under slavery, there was kind of this exploitation, and obviously the predatory loan people themselves, and like the people in the 60s who were particularly flipping the houses and stuff, like they were making money. But overall, it's not so clear anymore to me that in aggregate, it would be like, it's a beneficial thing that so many Black people are in poverty for the white people. But I feel like this dialogue is often framed like it still is, and so like if you're going to try to lift Black people up, it's going to like pull everybody else down. And I'm not sure that's true, and if it's not true, then it would be nice to make the dialogue different, because I think it definitely holds back any efforts to have reparations or to like fix the problem in certain kinds of ways.
I think, I mean, I think a lot of it is this idea that the money has to come from somewhere, that it has to come from taxes or something like that. I think if we as a society started to understand that is not actually the case, then that would maybe remove some of these barriers.
Well, another part of it that was interesting to me is that it's not necessarily that anyone goes down in absolute terms. It's the gap shrinking.
Right.
It's the hierarchy of power changing that may be what scared people.
Maybe, yeah, it could be. Although I think I wonder though. Like, I think people in countries that have less wealth gap aren't necessarily less happy. It's not clear to me that actually is a real problem.
Yeah, and I
don't know if maybe you disagree, but
I think most rich people would be happier if there wasn't as much poverty around them.
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking about that too.
Even I mean, especially if it meant not taking away anything from their wealth.
Let me go into it more.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
by the standards of 300 years ago, everyone in America is rich. Everyone has running water. Everyone has heat. Maybe even has Netflix.
Yeah.
And so the way we define rich and poor, they aren't defined in an absolute sense. That's you are literally starving. It's kind of an absolute floor where if you're starving, you're poor. But above that, it becomes relatively defined. Where in America, the poor may or may not have a car. The middle class definitely has a car. The rich have a car. Whereas, for example, China, a car is a status symbol. It's I am rich, I own a car. That's actually been changing a lot recently. But the point is they're relatively defined. So if you make any group richer, even if the rich have the same amount of wealth, their psychological richness shrinks a bit.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. I also think, in terms of for the people who are poor, there is still absolute poverty. It might not be what it was 300 years ago, but certainly, like if 1 in 6 children in the United States is food insecure, which I think is accurate, then that's, like having access to food and not having access to food, that's like an absolute thing. And, like even having a car or not having a car, that can be a big difference to a family.
Yeah, and I think that probably people are able to see it more one-to-one, that they're losing something. People are afraid of migrant workers, for example, coming and taking jobs that they might have had. It's less a perception of the gap in wealth and more immediate for some people, and racism springs from that sense of something being taken away. They can see the effect of that.
Right, like
And-
Sultan was saying about fear of people taking your jobs and stuff like that too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Any comment?
Oh, we got another comment. Great discussion. With basic income, which I'm assuming is universal basic income, could that help Black Americans catch up with the rest of America?
Good question.
So I would say yeah. So yeah, we are talking about universal basic income, and what it does is it gives everybody more freedom. So it's not necessarily going to close the income gap, but the first few dollars you get of income are going to have a lot more impact than later on. So if you make everyone not poor, then in terms of catching up to the rest of Americans in lifestyle and in the quality of life, I think basic income would go a long way.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
And like hopefully would have effects on crime and incarceration and things like that too.
Yeah, I mean,
which is another big issue.
If you're not desperate and you have an income to support yourself, and basic income can be any level. I want the basic income to be as high as whatever the economy can afford. Some people limit it to kind of a subsistence level, but I tend to not stop there. I tend to want to go like to whatever the economy can sustain. And the more kind of just guaranteed income that you're going to get every day, kind of the more freedom you have. You can rent an apartment and not have to worry about having enough credit or something like that because everybody knows you're going to have your basic income. You can, there's a lot more flexibility. You could move to somewhere that doesn't have, the job you need because you don't necessarily need a job anymore. And you can spend and buy and wherever if suddenly, all the Black consumers in the country have, a lot of money to spend, now they can even help shape the direction that businesses go. Like they want to make money, they're going to go to where the money is. And if the consumers have the money, and if a lot more Black consumers have money to spend now, then there's going to be a lot more services for Black people. Not that they necessarily need different services, but it's I think it would go a long way toward helping everybody, everyone who's left behind, kind of catch up and fix some of the damage that's been caused by racism, without actually making racism kind of the center of the topic. Yeah.
What I think was her point about unintended consequences. Well, the ways in which businesses shift necessarily be good ways.
Yeah.
All these people suddenly have money.
Yeah.
Will they necessarily shift to satisfy their needs, or are they going to try to just bilk them out of it as fast as they can?
Yeah, they're going to try to bilk them out of the money as fast as they can. But what they're doing is they're providing something that people want to spend their money on. Okay. And if they're able to provide even more stuff and bilk even more money, then we can increase the amount of the basic income. Assuming that prices kind of stay where they are. But if we're not worried about money kind of naturally circulating back to consumers anymore, then we can just keep giving consumers money, and money can flow through the productive part of the economy, right. And then people can. Hey, Katie. And then that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you get money and you keep spending it and getting stuff that you want and need, and the businesses are providing it for you, that's not necessarily the end of the world.
No, you're right. There is no bilking in a market economy.
Right.
But I think you're right that like you need some of the legal protections that allow a market economy to operate, like transparent contracts and stuff like that. And I suspect, even based on this article, that there has been improvement in that in terms of like the 1960s versus now, that like there's more equal legal protection.
Yeah.
So that would help it operate the way that Alex is saying, where like the new business opportunities would actually be offering something that consumers wanted to buy and like decently the same way that other consumer things work, I suspect. But,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And certainly basic income isn't going to fix, people's racist feelings, but it can help repair some of the racist system that's in place.
there's one way in which I was wondering whether it
Yeah.
might help with that, in the sense that you have this thing that's going to everybody, and so there is this sense that everybody has some freedom and something to offer. And so, looking out into the world, that like everybody has this kind of like, if it's high enough, everybody kind of has this baseline of resources. And I do feel like that would change perceptions. There would be fewer, you wouldn't necessarily automatically write off certain people as probably dangerous, probably have nothing to offer, like probably have no buying power, probably have no like education, whatever it is. If the basic income was high enough, there wouldn't really be a group of people anymore that you would be able to see
If,
like
if
that.
everyone has a basic income and you're walking down the street and you see a black guy coming toward you, you're not worried based on stereotypes that he's going to be poor and desperate and potentially
Dangerous.
dangerous. Yeah.
Right, exactly.
I think that's a really important point. So people's minds can change, given this framework. Yeah, I think
they could.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, it won't fix everything, but it could help a little bit.
Yeah, Richard.
Yeah.
There's an example in India, the guy standing brought up that during his experiment there, that when he first started the experiment, that he wanted to talk to women in an Islamic village or whatever, and they wanted to talk to him, and they had to go have their pictures taken in a special building because they couldn't talk to men, and towards the end of the program, we came back to visit, and the women didn't have to wear headscarves anymore, and they're like, we don't have to listen to the elders anymore because we have our own money.
Huh. What changed? How did they get their money? Oh, the program was giving
so
them money?
they basically had a basic income and they were no longer financially dependent on.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
That's interesting.
Huh. What was this experiment?
There was a basic income experiment from 2008 until 2013 in India.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know about that one. Is this a precursor to the Sikkim program? Okay.
That was one of the things that changed the mind of the Indian politicians.
Cool.
That is really cool.
All right.
You want another quote?
Yeah, we can do another quote, unless anyone has any thoughts before I move on. All right. Effectively, the black family in America is working without a safety net. When a financial calamity strikes, a medical emergency, divorce, job loss, the fall is precipitous. So this is, this is when people are just, living on the edge, paycheck to paycheck, and then something happens and they can't pay back their debts, they lose their house, they lose their job, your car breaks down, you can't go to work anymore, you lose your job, that kind of thing. So, kind of to Ryan's point from before, this isn't going to be a thing anymore with a high enough basic income. It's, I don't like to frame basic income as a safety net, because a safety net implies that, there's an exceptional circumstance, you fall out of where you would normally be expected to be in the economy, and this net kind of catches you. I like to think of basic income as infrastructure, economic infrastructure, that, consumers need to be able to spend money in order to be able to buy stuff, in order for the economy to function, and basic income is a way of getting them that money. So when you have that infrastructure in place, you don't need a safety net anymore, because there's a railing that prevents you from falling. Or a foundation that holds you up, that kind of thing. But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this relates a little bit to what I was saying before with some of the effects of a basic income. Like, it does mean that you have something to fall back on, and sort of fewer sort of huge negative sort of problems like this. Like, even if you have a big expense, you can people know you have an income coming in the future, so you can get credit that way, for example.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it helps smooth things out for everyone.
And people could, if it's big enough, people could save out of it too if they wanted to.
Yeah, and a lot of these points are brought up in the article. And I think they're really important points. And these are things that like, yes, a basic income will directly help with that, even though it might not be so directly helpful in terms of like getting our society to admit the wrongs of history and come to terms with them and that kind of thing. So yeah.
I'm just thinking about racism that's kind of triggered by thoughts of poverty. I'm just thinking about what you're saying. And that's true, but it's also true that there are other kinds of racism that have nothing to do with how wealthy or not somebody is. And, you know, a wealthy black woman can walk into a hotel and somebody thinks that's the maid, for example. I mean, it's not just about, but I mean, I agree that it would make a difference. I'm just trying to tease out the differences in what kinds of racism could be addressed and what can't be, except with education or maybe time.
And I guess you have examples like anti-Semitism. You know, I don't think it's the case. I think if anything, Jewish Americans are more wealthy, or at least the same compared to other groups. But you still have anti-Semitism, so you know it's not only about poverty.
A different kind of prejudice.
So for sure, I think I don't know. I think I agree with Alex that it's not necessarily that a basic income would eliminate all of these things, but some of the ones that have more to do with poverty.
Right. Yeah. No, I'm just wondering about the other part and how it could be addressed.
Well, recently,
I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
No, you broke it down really well into statistical and norm-based.
Right.
If you shift the mean, of course, the mean-based part shifts. Norm-based, I think anti-Semitism, until very recently, was a very good example of how norms can shift. How concerted effort across all of our society really shifted norms around something. We said, like, that was too far. We're going to change the way we think about this.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. And on the flip side, on the negative side, in Nazi Germany, you saw it flip the other way, where like anti-Semitism got a lot worse really quickly. Not based on a change in circumstances of the people, but just based on the norms in the society and propaganda and stuff. So it can go either direction.
Yeah.
Good point.
And sometimes, you know, the two can reinforce each other. So
They can,
you know, if you know, black people are poorer and they're more likely to be the maids, then that can reinforce the norm of thinking that you know, the black person who walks into the hotel is the maid.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you have a basic income and now, you know, it's no longer the case that, you know, it's just the black people who have to work those kind of jobs. Like, in order to get people to work as a maid or any kind of job, you have to take into account that they have this basic income and you have to pay them what you need to incentivize them to do the work still. Then maybe over time people can learn that, you know,
those stereotypes don't apply.
They start not applying because the statistics start not applying anymore. And then the norms have room to shift once you've changed the reality. So let's do another one. I already did that one. An America that asks what it owes its most vulnerable citizens is improved and humane. An America that looks away is ignoring not just the sins of the past, but the sins of the present and the certain sins of the future. So, is it useful to ask what we owe our most vulnerable citizens, even if we're still ignoring all the harm we've done, all the sins we've committed? And I think it is.
I think so.
Yeah, and it's interesting as I'm thinking about it, like even the use of the term vulnerable there reminds me of what you said about safety nets. Like there's this idea that certain citizens need our help. They're kind of in the position almost of like children. And so we think of those differently than the citizens that are like, you know, managing themselves fine and all this stuff, which again is different from how we often talk about a basic income, which has to do with everybody having value and sort of wanting to give everybody what they can and having, you know, an economy that functions for the people and that kind of thing. This still singles out like certain people in a way. Do you see what I mean? As like needing a special kind of help.
Right.
Not that that isn't true in a certain sense, but in another sense, we might think of it as the norm for the economy and the society to provide for people, which is a different way of framing it.
Right.
Than certain people being vulnerable and other people aren't vulnerable. They can kind of handle themselves. It's sort of like almost the implication of that framing.
And with a basic income, you can take care of the vulnerable citizens without singling them out as being vulnerable.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
I guess rhetorically, sometimes I feel like that backfires for the
Yeah,
reasons we're talking
yeah.
about. Then people are like, no, we don't want to help those people,
Right.
or like, why are they getting
Yeah.
special? Whatever. It kind of goes.
Right.
It's a little bit double-edged sometimes. Or in other stereotype ways, like we're talking about, like maybe we do want to help them, but then we don't think of them as having as much to contribute or give
Right.
back. It's like now you're sort of typecast as somebody who needs to be helped.
Right.
I don't know.
Okay.
Cool quote.
Yeah. So I mean, I think this just kind of speaks to acknowledging the past and acknowledging the stuff we've done wrong and wanting to do better in the future as being something that doesn't necessarily have to be tied to improving the quality of life of the most vulnerable people. Yeah. Go to another one. Old age insurance, Social Security proper, and unemployment insurance excluded farm workers and domestics, jobs heavily occupied by blacks. When President Roosevelt signed Social Security into law in 1935, 65% of African Americans nationally, and between 70 and 80% in the South, were ineligible.
Oh,
I was
never
really
knew
surprised
that.
by this.
Wow.
Yeah.
Why?
Because they were farm workers or they
but-
were domestic workers.
Okay.
I mean,
So they were disproportionately black, but I mean, was there a reason for
Excluding
those?
people.
Yeah,
They're
those
self-employed and
occupations.
didn't pay into the system.
right.
That's what my my great grandfather, he owned a bakery, and the reason why he didn't want to work for anyone else because he didn't want to pay 35% of his income.
Into Social Security.
Mhm.
So, but farm workers and domestics, they're not
They're
self-employed. They're self-employed.
Or they're contract employees or something.
Oh,
Yeah, so they're like Uber drivers.
Yeah, right. Got it. Okay.
Yeah,
That's
so you can't get
interesting.
unemployment insurance
Right.
from being a
Yeah.
farm
But
worker.
that, like
Right.
the farm worker was sharecropper.
Yep.
And so they paid like it said in the article they only got like 15 or 5% of the or 15 cents or 5% per 50 if the cotton was worth 50 cents per barrel or whatever a bushel,
Mm-hmm.
they only got 15 or 5 cents depending on what the farmer decided to pay them.
Yep. Wow.
Bale of cotton. Yeah. And the next sentence actually is good too. The NAACP protested, calling the new American safety net a sieve with holes just big enough for the majority of Negroes to fall through.
Yeah.
So basic income has no holes that anyone can fall through,
Right.
unless you're saying, oh well, only citizens get it, and then you've got some holes there. But ideally, you wouldn't structure it that way.
I meant to ask about that earlier when she mentioned, or maybe you did. Someone's walking down the street, you think, oh, they get their income, but there are areas of the country with a large non-citizen workforce.
Right.
That does make up a large percentage of minorities. And I was curious whether in this case, you mentioned. So now I know is that you mentioned yes, it would go to non-citizens as well, which might make things politically more thorny.
Right.
Well, or I guess another way to put it is this highlights the fact that decision about whether it went to citizens or not would have a lot of social consequences for racism or stereotyping or whatever of people. If it didn't go to everybody, it would have a lot of consequences.
If it didn't go to non-citizens, then you might see, maybe an effect on people being less racist toward black people, but maybe being more racist towards Hispanic people or something like that.
I was thinking kind of a new nativism where we draw the new line of American, not American. Maybe American is more inclusive, but we become less accepting towards immigrants.
Right.
Yeah. You can't necessarily tell whether someone's American or not by looking at them unless they have a certain race, unless they have something different about their features or something like that. So if you're in a border state in Texas or Arizona or something like that, and you see a Hispanic person, then you might worry that this person might not be American and might not be getting a basic income and therefore might be poor or that kind of thing.
Right. You touched on a really, really thorny thing, which is then that in a lot of people's minds, being American does not necessarily correlate with holding a green card or a U.S. passport. That they see American as an ethnicity, not just a state.
Right.
And
yeah, if someone from Europe, is walking down the street, then you might think, oh, well, that person's. You might not think about it. You might just assume they're an American, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Even though we have like more people like illegally immigrate from Canada than from Mexico, like they just overstay their visas. But
Yeah, but they're disguised as Americans.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's somebody up there.
Yeah, so this is kind of just speaking to what we were talking about. In order to pass New Deal policies, Southern politicians made it where domestic workers couldn't benefit, which, as stated, the majority of Black Americans were maids, sharecroppers, etc. at the time. So this kind of speaks to what we were talking about before, where the politics are kind of constrained by the norms too. So it's all part of this cycle.
Right. So in order to get any of it passed, they had to make this concession.
Yeah.
Which is like that constant struggle of like, do you pass something knowing that you're leaving some people behind,
Right.
and like hope that you can maybe make it back up later, because
Right.
but then you've like ameliorated, like if this is an issue that comes up in abolition a lot of like
Right.
when you make things less, but they're like, oh, like the death penalty is really bad, but like once we make these carve outs, we're like, oh, okay, so we can't do the death penalty for minors, we can't do it for people with like certain like cognitive impairments, then it seems less, but you're like, oh, well, now we're just giving the death penalty to like people who probably
Right.
deserve it. It makes it much harder, but no, really, we should not do the death penalty
Oh.
at all. And so it's these trade-offs of you're like, great, we're not murdering children, that seems like a good thing.
Yeah, right.
But then it
Right.
makes it harder
To
to
pass the
abolish the
overall.
whole, that's, or in this case, to pass the full thing. You're like, well, we give Social Security to so many people. We did such a great thing.
Yeah.
Why do we need to go back and like catch, like,
Yeah, that's
get people
interesting.
caught up?
Yeah, Richard.
The motto of the Senate is the perfect is the enemy of the good.
Yeah.
And so you want to like build on what you can actually do right now. And so you don't have to worry about not having anything at all.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree with that. Like at any given moment, you want to provide the most benefit that you can. You want to do the best that you can, but it can be frustrating. But not doing it that way can lead to problems. Like basic income passed the House twice in the 1970s, or something very similar to a basic income passed the House twice in the 1970s, and then it was rejected by Senate Democrats because the amount wasn't high enough.
Right.
So.
Democrats.
Yeah. Yeah, under the Nixon administration. Yeah.
So we could have had something for all this time.
Yeah.
Yeah, it would have made a really big difference. Now, would it have been the case that once that was in place, it would have been really hard to increase the amount? Maybe, I don't know.
But it might have been easier too, because the concept would have
but
been in the.
we
consciousness.
haven't. Yeah, and we haven't increased the amount anyway. So yeah.
Yeah.
So
It's tough. Which way is that going to go? Yeah.
I think that's it. I agree with that. That kind of rule of thumb. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
It's just hard to to make sure that you keep that you still keep striving towards perfection, because it's easy to be like, well, it's good enough, our work here is done,
yeah, it's tricky. And a lot of times maybe you'll feel like it is good enough, and maybe you shift your priorities to working on something else that's also going to make an impact too, but you haven't fixed the thing that wasn't perfect.
Yeah. Maybe I'm not trying to dictate anyone's personal political choices about oh, you need to work on issue X until you die, but that sometimes movements feel like, oh, we've solved the thing. Like, we got same-sex marriage, great. Like, we fixed all the things for queer people. And it's like, no, but the trans people who you keep saying that, you're going to get back to them, they're still getting disproportionately murdered and they can be fired. And, did we forget about them?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I chose this one because, obviously basic income has no holes in it, and I think the fact that it's so simple means that you're not really negotiating as much. I guess the fact that it's simple means people will try to negotiate exceptions and stuff into these kinds of policies, but I don't know, I like the simplicity of it, and I don't think there's anything about the simplicity of basic income that makes it less effective if implemented, and I think that's important. And the simpler the rules are, the the harder it is for those rules to be
Bent or broken.
bent or broken or manipulated, or finding loopholes and that kind of thing. Yeah.
Good point.
So let's go to another one. So this is Clyde Ross, who's one of the main people that he interviews in this story. So he lived in west side of Chicago, North Lonsdale, which was an area that kind of became ghettoized in the mid 20th century as more black people moved in, and then it got redlined, and it got worse and worse and worse. So here, so this is Ross talking. The problem was money, Ross told me. Without the money, you can't move. You can't educate your kids. You can't give them the right kind of food. Can't make the house look good. They think this neighborhood is where they're supposed to be. It changes their outlook. My kids were going to the best schools in this neighborhood, and then I couldn't keep them in there. So, I mean, this, again, you don't need to blame anyone, or you don't need anyone to accept blame in order to understand that giving him money would have made a really big difference in his life. Yeah. And also, I might add, if everybody has a basic income, it's a lot harder to justify the argument that people aren't going to pay back their mortgages.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's a lot harder to rationalize redlining in that way. So if you're redlining, then you need to come up with another reason. Yeah. And I don't think, there's explicit redlining as much anymore, although, certainly insurance companies do evaluate and lenders do evaluate, the prices of homes and, the risks and all of that. So it's not gone completely. Yeah. But if everyone had money, it gets a lot easier, a lot less risky to lend to anyone. Yeah. Anyone have any thoughts about this one? I think I picked quotes that all had a similar theme. I had like 30 or 40 different ones, and then I narrowed it down. But
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the last one. One cannot escape the question by hand-waving the past. Okay, I guess the question is, if we conclude that the conditions in North Lawndale and Black America are not inexplicable, but are instead precisely what you'd expect of a community that for centuries has lived in America's crosshairs, then what are we to make of the world's oldest democracy? One cannot escape the question by hand-waving at the past, disavowing the acts of one's ancestors, nor by citing a recent date of ancestral immigration. The last slaveholder has been dead for a very long time. The last soldier to endure Valley Forge has been dead much longer. To proudly claim the veteran and disown the slaveholder is patriotism a la carte. So I think there's some truth to this. I think there's a little bit of false equivalence. So it's not that we're not paying money to the descendants of the soldiers who endured Valley Forge. So Valley Forge was an encampment during the American Revolution that was difficult to live in Virginia. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, we did pay other pensions. We did pay the pensions to their soldiers and their wives for as long as they lived.
Right.
We do still have, the Daughters of the Revolution, the Sons of the Revolution.
Oh, that's a good point.
We definitely still claim that. And we definitely, as a nation, are very bad about saying, much less so now, but very bad about, World War II, we beat the Nazis, we beat the Kaiser, we read the Revolution, but slavery, but the internment camps.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. I guess I was trying to draw a distinction between kind of the money aspect and the acknowledging history aspect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There were the Japanese internment camps in World War II. There was actually reparations under the first George Bush.
Oh, interesting.
There you go.
And was it to the people who were actually in the internment camps? Huh.
Yeah.
Interesting.
That's interesting. That is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that I was confused a little bit about some of the parts that were more like this in the article.
Yeah.
Because I would have liked to know a little bit more concretely what on the sort of moral side or whatever, what would be satisfying or what would be helpful? Like, does it have to do with teaching the right history in the schools like we're talking about? Does it have to do with museums that are
Right.
public? Does it like what kinds of things would
Right.
feel like a satisfying way to kind of not be disacknowledging the past?
Right.
Well, I mean, I think Max's point of just acknowledging as loudly, the things we are not proud of as the things we are
Right.
proud of. I mean, obviously in life, you generally are more excited about talking about the things you are proud of, and less excited about talking about the things you feel guilty about. So I think that's somewhat
Right.
normal human behavior.
But I also think go ahead.
Yeah, no, you go.
Well, I also feel like it's a little bit tricky because it's not clear to me that everybody does feel connected personally, like they can feel good about themselves because of either Valley Forge or the Constitution
Right.
or whatever they like or whatever they don't like about the history of the country. Like that's a little bit personal, and I feel like it's not obvious to me that people do take on the credit and not the blame. I think some people think of them both as history.
Yeah.
And very separate from the
Yeah.
things they themselves do and accomplish.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just like right now, they may not feel personally responsible for what a president they don't like does.
Right.
Even if it's in
Yeah.
their country.
Right.
Yeah.
I see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But while that's true, I think there's also a way in which like white America is really is oh, the American dream, and we like to talk about our ideals of democracy, and a thing that I see on Twitter discourse a lot is during this current presidency, people will say oh, this isn't really America, and other people, usually people of color, are no, this has always been America. That a lot of white people, even if they don't feel a lot of connections the daughters of the American Revolution necessarily, are oh yeah, but America is about truth, justice, and freedom and fairness, and we threw off the British, and we're so into freedom and all these good things,
Right.
so that we can say oh, the current internment camps that we're doing, oh, that's not American.
Right.
And other people are oh, but do you remember the Japanese internment camps? Do you remember
Right.
slavery? That people
That's
will buy
interesting.
sort of
Yeah.
the ideals of all the positive things about America, and not be wow, yeah, these things are happening. They're the obvious outgrowth of centuries of racism,
Right,
or
right,
centuries of xenophobia, or centuries of colonialism. That we don't see that
Yeah. It's kind
as
an
part of the history. We
interesting
see it as either
yeah.
distinct pieces of oh, slavery, that was a bad thing that happened way long ago, or oh yeah, this one terrible president that's happening right now is this weird anomaly.
Right. Yeah, I think I agree, and I think I'd like to see I was saying before, more of a I do feel we learned about slavery as a really bad thing, but more of a connection of the dots, the way that this article does would have been really helpful. We learned about segregation too, but not necessarily all of these economic things that kind of trace through.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
We learn about the bad things not as patterns, but as anomalies. We had
Yeah,
slavery, and that was an
yeah,
accident.
that's
Japanese
true.
internment camps, that was an accident. But
Yeah.
America really stands for these other things.
Yeah.
Right.
So we
Right.
teach America is this
That's a good
thing,
point, yeah.
and all these exceptions, those don't count.
Right.
There's no pattern there. Don't look at
Right.
them, because those are
Yeah.
anomalies.
Yeah.
The
That's
same could
really
be
good
said
for
of,
that it shows the pattern.
The same
and
could be
the
said of
cascading effect.
human history too. One thing that I feel we miss is we talk about American slavery outside of the context of the history of slavery being very predominant throughout the world for most of civilized human history. So there's I guess different layers of this understanding, so that you avoid maybe repeating things, or you just have a different context, and you understand progress too. I think that's equally important. I mean, the idea that we shouldn't have slavery is a pretty big deal. On the flip side, for a lot of history, people have been yeah, slavery, that's great, we should do that, that's what we should do. I mean, I'm not joking, right? If you go back to the ancient Greeks, they justified slavery, Americans justified slavery, Europeans justified, people all over the world have justified slavery for a really long time. So anyway, I'm just sort of rambling now, but I'm kind of agreeing with you that I think a lot of the different aspects of the context are lost.
And the question is, by saying those are anomalies, are we aspiring? And we're saying America is better. America should be better than this. American
Right.
ideals are better than this, or are we erasing?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? Yeah.
Erasing, did you say?
I said, are we aspiring to better and saying those should be
Yeah.
anomalies, that we can do better, or
Or
are we erasing them
erasing
by calling
them.
them anomalies?
Right, that is kind of a good point, because
Yeah.
you don't want to lose what I said is the progress, the benefit of having an ideal that slavery isn't a good thing, or that you want things to be different or better. But I also feel just understanding cause and effect is a part of teaching people about their society in a complete way too. Like even if
Yeah.
you didn't care about racism per se, like
Yeah.
how did we end up in this particular situation? How did it end up that certain
Mhm.
people are doing this way and certain people are doing that way? I mean, there's some like just facts of the matter that people might want to understand. And if you don't have those, you tend to have more of this like blaming the victim, like, oh, it must be something like he mentioned briefly in the article about like irresponsible culture or this or
Right.
that. Like you just kind of
Yeah.
import these other like very superficial theories onto it because you don't actually have the knowledge of why things are looking the way that they are. Like that erasure part. Yeah.
I think there is no any country that doesn't have any slavery history in the past.
Right. There's no country like that, you said?
Yeah, there's no.
Yeah,
So
unless there's a
it-
really new country somewhere.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really new. So everybody
Yeah.
did same bad
Mhm.
thing in the past.
Yeah.
Although I think the chattel slavery that the U.S. did, like it's often slavery throughout history has often been more of a like prisoner of war, indentured servitude, kind of like using like people as literal property that you're born into as a more unusual situation. But it's true that
Yeah.
enslaving people for labor in some capacity is pretty universal.
We
But
kind of industrialized slavery as we were industrializing everything else. I know a lot of people kind of blame Eli Whitney for,
The cotton gin.
yeah, he invented the cotton gin, and a lot of people
Oh.
say like that's why slavery got so bad in America because
Really?
he invented that. Yeah, because now you had a way to process so much more cotton at once, so you needed
More
yeah,
picked. Oh,
Yeah.
Unintended consequences.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
So there's definitely some technological aspect to
Huh.
why slavery got so bad when it did, and also why it ended when it did.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Um,
Totally. Yeah, I don't know enough to like make exact comparisons between different kinds, but I just think it's been pointed out also, and it's interesting that we started also to have the idea that maybe there was something not so great about people being property, sort of more fundamentally.
we the
yeah.
owning class got that idea.
Yes, exactly. Well, yeah. I presume
Enslaved
nobody
people
was a big
always thought it
fan
was a
of
bad
being an
idea.
enslaved person.
Yeah.
Although if there wasn't a distinct population, then that gets a little more blurry. But yeah, I agree. Like what I mean is like the people benefiting. It's never so surprising to me when the people not benefiting don't like it, but when the people at least materially benefiting start to change their mind, I find that more interesting.
Yeah.
Kind of a side note, I guess. But.
all right, so we're getting toward the end. Let's go around and get final thoughts about racism and basic income.
Yeah, I feel like it was a really helpful discussion for me. I think that some of the points about like people fearing their jobs being taken or people assuming things about other people's level of ability to contribute or danger could be very strongly like ameliorated by a basic income, in addition to the fact that it goes to everybody, so it might be something that brings people together as opposed to creating more kind of resentment or feeling forced on people. Or and then I do think that one subset of the really big problems that you see due to the history of racism especially are like the extreme poverty cases are kind of like the worst cases, and so at least it would deal with that. And then I guess I imagine we could kind of see where things are, or like continue to also work on things in other kinds of ways, because it wouldn't necessarily address everything.
I think you took all my points.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay.
Yeah, it's okay to pass.
I agree.
Sorry.
Yeah, pass about that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh,
You gotta start having me go
Race-
last.
Racism has different, lots of different reasons, but you'll be able to have it at least for one reason.
Yeah, cool.
As I was thinking the whole time, but I really liked the idea of everyone having enough money to survive on a basic level so that you wouldn't assume people were stealing as a result of their color of their skin in order to survive.
And the things Bethany said. So I think it's been a couple things that we like sort of didn't super much touch on, but like Alex, you talked about like, oh, so UBI like doesn't have any holes in it, and I feel like I don't have your optimism about that. That like that the issue of like, does it go to non-citizens? Like,
Right.
how would you actually, if there are people like there are lots of people who are homeless and don't have bank accounts, like how do you get that money to people? Which I know is sort of like outside the scope of the racism thing specifically that we're talking about today. But I just wanted to like put that on the table as a like some of the pragmatics of how do you not let people fall through seem like really important.
Yep.
Pragmatic
Good points. Richard?
Well, what she was saying about bank accounts, well, if you don't have a license and it's difficult to have ID or whatever to vote, and you need to vote to elect representatives to
Right.
make the changes that, like, instituting a UBI, then there's just too many issues that you have to solve to institute a UBI. Like with the past election, in South Dakota with the senator, she was only elected. The previous senator was only elected by like 3,000 Native American votes, and then there was right before the election there was the Supreme Court said we're not going to wait for until after the election to institute the new ID, the postal policy, and so that a lot of Native Americans were disenfranchised because of that, and there's also you can have postal banking. So if you live in some address, then you can have a bank account
At the post office.
at the post office for that address.
Yeah, so I think Elizabeth's points were all really good points, and there are ways to kind of address these things, but they're not, it's not as simple as just saying basic income has no holes in it. I think that was maybe an exaggeration on my part.
Ryan has something.
Ryan says his final thought: basic income would definitely be helpful for everyone. Yet with our government being on the side of big business, things could still get hairy with the cost of living skyrocketing. A combination of basic income and set-asides for Black Americans would go a long way.
Set aside what?
Set aside money, presumably, or some other kind of benefits. So I think there's a huge problem of racism. Obviously, we've come a long way, and I hope we can use that fact to be able to see how far we can go and how well we are at going places and improving things. I think, basic income helps with a lot of the problems that are associated with racism. And of course, I'm really interested in basic income and making it happen. And I think once it's in place, there's still going to be plenty of problems to deal with, including problems related to racism, and we'll be in a better position to think about how to take the next step. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex.
Thanks. Yeah. Great. Not clapping?
Not clapping. I didn't give a presentation.